At 11:47 a.m. on May 29, 1943, the roar of four Cyclone engines rolled across the gray runways of RAF Alconbury. Captain James Hartwell, just 26 years old, but already a veteran of 42 combat missions, climbed into the cockpit of an aircraft unlike anything he had ever flown. The ground crew below him loaded the last belt of .50 caliber ammunition into the new twin-chin turret, locking it into place with a metallic click that echoed through the morning mist. The plane smelled of oil, metal, and anticipation. Its name was Hedgehog, and its type designation, YB-40, was the Army Air Force's latest experiment, a flying fortress reborn as a flying destroyer. The engineers at Douglas had stripped a standard B-17F of everything that didn't shoot. The bomb bay was gone. The bomb sight was replaced by a chin-mounted gun turret. Twin mounts now filled the waist windows, and an extra dorsal turret had been bolted just behind the radio room. Every angle of attack, from nose to tail, was now covered by overlapping fields of fire. 16 .50 caliber guns, more firepower than some entire squadrons. 11,000 rounds of ammunition were crammed into its belly, its skin reinforced with steel plates that made the aircraft 4,000 pounds heavier than any other fortress in the sky. It was, in theory, an indestructible escort, built not to drop bombs, but to defend those that did. Yet, as Hartwell sat in his seat and felt the aircraft's sluggish response under his hands, he knew something was off. The control yoke felt heavier, the climb rate was slower. Even the sound of the engines seemed strained, as though the plane itself was groaning under the weight of its ambition. But the mission was clear. The 8th Air Force had been bleeding bombers over Europe, 173 flying fortresses lost in just 3 months. Without long-range fighter escorts, the daylight raids into Germany had become suicide runs. The YB-40 was the answer, or so everyone hoped. If fighters couldn't protect bombers all the way to their targets, then perhaps a bomber could protect its own kind. By 1:25 p.m., the formation at Alconbury was ready. The sky shimmered with the heat from 168 bombers revving for takeoff. The airfield trembled under the power of thousands of horsepower. Hartwell looked out the window and saw the other 6 YB-40s lined up on the taxiway, their gun barrels glinting in the pale light. Colonel William Reed, commanding the 92nd Bombardment Group, had handpicked 7 crews for this first combat test. They would fly as escorts for the main bomber stream on its mission to Saint-Nazaire, where German submarine pens lay carved into the French coast like concrete claws. The plan was simple. 7 YB-40s would take up the most dangerous positions, the tail end of the formation, the low squadron, where German fighters loved to strike. Hartwell started the engines. The Cyclones roared to life one by one, their propellers slicing through the air. At 1:50 p.m., the control tower cleared them for takeoff. Hedgehog rolled down the runway, heavy and deliberate, straining against gravity before finally lifting into the sky. Behind her, row after row of B-17s followed, until the entire horizon was filled with silver wings. At 3:30 p.m., the formation reached the French coast. The channel below looked calm, deceptively peaceful. Ahead, black puffs of flak bloomed like malignant flowers over Guernsey. Over the radio, the chatter began. Short, clipped voices reporting fighters scrambling from airfields near Rennes. Bandits inbound. Tally 4, maybe 6. Inside Hedgehog, the air grew tense. The UB-40 was burning fuel faster than expected, the extra weight forcing the engines to run hotter than their design allowed. The flight engineer, Technical Surgeon Paul Morrison, crouched by the throttle quadrant, eyes on the gauges. The number 3 engine's cylinder head temperature was creeping into the red. "She's running hot," he warned. Hartwell eased back the throttle, but there was only so much he could do. The flying destroyer could climb, but it could not climb fast. At 4:02 p.m., the bombers reached Saint-Nazaire. Through the breaks in the clouds, Hartwell saw the target below, the sprawling submarine pens glistening under the thin afternoon sun. The lead groups released their bombs, their bellies opening to drop waves of destruction. The earth erupted in black plumes, shockwaves rippling outward even from 20,000 feet. Mission complete. The formation turned for home, empty and light. The standard B-17s began to climb, freed from their loads, but the UB-40s, still weighed down by tons of ammunition and armor, could not keep pace. Hartwell pushed the throttles forward, maximum continuous power. The airspeed needle crept to 148 miles per hour and stayed there. The rest of the formation accelerated to 160, then 165. Within minutes, Hedgehog was lagging behind. 3 miles, 4 miles. The other UB-40s were struggling too, drifting toward the rear of their squadrons, easy prey for the hunters circling above. At 4:15 p.m., Morrison reported fuel burn again, worse than expected. They were running rich just to stay aloft. Hartwell said nothing. He could already see the inevitable forming on the horizon. Behind them, faint contrails cut through the sky. The waist gunner, Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney, hauled out from his window. Bandits, 4 o'clock high. Tiny specks, growing fast. Focke-Wulf 19s, 6 of them, maybe more. Rising from the west. The German pilots had been waiting for this. Stragglers. They always waited for the stragglers. Hartwell keyed the intercom. Guns free. Track your targets. The gunners came alive. The chin turret swung forward, the ball turret rotated smoothly, and the twin mounts in the waist windows tracked left and right. Then came the first attack. A diving Focke-Wulf 19 from 12 o'clock high. The tail gunner fired first, the tracers arcing upward, glowing against the pale sky. The German broke off before he could even fire, startled by the storm of bullets that met him. The second attack came from 11 o'clock high, 2 fighters in trail formation. The chin turret gunner waited until they were within range and unleashed a 4-second burst. Silver streaks of 50 caliber rounds stitched across the lead fighter's nose. Black smoke poured from the engine. It rolled inverted and plunged toward the sea. Delaney called it out. Splash 1. The second fighter pulled away. For 6 minutes, everything worked. The UB-40 performed exactly as designed, a fortress within a fortress, its 16 guns overlapping in perfect arcs. No fighter dared to close in. But the victory came with a cruel cost. The longer Hedgehog fought, the slower she became. The engines screamed, fuel drained, and the formation ahead dwindled into specks. 6 miles now, then 7 miles. They were alone in the sky, still surrounded by enemies, still hundreds of miles from home. The mission that had promised protection had turned into a trap. The hunter had become the hunted.
The sky above France that afternoon looked calm, but every pilot in the formation knew it was a lie. Beneath the thin clouds, the Luftwaffe waited. At 26 years old, Captain James Hartwell had already seen more death than most men twice his age. But the YB-40 was something new, a beast too heavy to climb, too slow to flee, too proud to give up. As the bombers turned away from Saint-Nazaire, the main formation surged forward, leaving the flying destroyers trailing in their wake. It wasn't the first time Hartwell had watched distance grow between himself and safety, but this time the separation wasn't a tactical choice. It was physics. Standard B-17Fs, now lightened of their bomb loads, could cruise at 160 miles per hour and climb easily through the freezing haze. The YB-40s, still burdened with armor and ammunition, strained to maintain 145. Even with throttles at maximum continuous power, Hedgehog was losing ground with every passing minute. Morrison, the flight engineer, adjusted the mixture controls, his gloves blackened by oil, his eyes locked on the gauges. Number 3 engine's temperature needle trembled in the red. He pulled the power back, grimacing. "She can't take this much longer," he said through the intercom. Hartwell didn't reply. He knew it already. Every bolt, every vibration in the yoke told him the same thing. The flying destroyer could shoot, but it couldn't fly like the rest. The sky behind them grew darker. Contrails, long, sharp, converging lines cut toward the rear of the formation. German fighters, Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, climbing, closing. The radio hissed with voices from other YB-40s struggling to keep up. We're losing the group, 2 miles back and widening, 3 engines hot, can't push more. It wasn't a formation anymore, just isolated fortresses drifting through the clouds, each one heavy, tired, and alone. At 4:43 p.m., the first attack came. 3 Focke-Wulfs out of the sun, diving at 12 o'clock high. Hartwell called at headings. The gunners didn't need orders. The chin turret came alive, spitting fire, tracers cutting the sky into ribbons. The airframe shuddered under the combined recoil of 8 guns firing at once. The German leader rolled right, then straightened to fire, but the turret gunner caught him mid-burst. 50 caliber rounds chewed through his cowling, and the fighter flipped inverted, trailing a black smear of smoke before vanishing into the haze. The second Focke-Wulf broke off. The third followed, unwilling to fly through that wall of metal. For a moment, silence returned. Only the thrum of the engines and the smell of cordite. "One confirmed," Delaney shouted from the waist. "They don't like us, Skipper." Hartwell allowed himself a quick grin. "Let's make sure they keep it that way." But the victory was hollow. Every minute they spent firing cost them altitude and fuel. The engines screamed, the gauges dropped, and the distance to the main formation widened. 6 miles ahead, the other bombers were already over the channel. Hedgehog was still over France, limping west with nothing but empty air for cover. Morrison's calculations were grim. 90 minutes of fuel left, 70 minutes to base, if nothing went wrong. Something always went wrong. The Germans returned. This time they didn't dive. They stalked. 6 fighters formed a loose circle around the lone gunship, waiting, testing. They'd learned the YB-40's guns could kill anything that came close, but it couldn't maneuver, couldn't chase, couldn't run. They waited for weakness. When it came fast. 3 attacks from different angles, 1 high, 1 low, 1 straight ahead. The sky turned into a crossfire of tracers. Hartwell held the plane steady, muscles burning as the yoke fought against him. A cannon round slammed into the right wing, punching through a hydraulic line. The cockpit filled with a smell of leaking fluid. "Hydraulics out on the right gear," Morrison reported. "We'll have to crank it by hand if we make it home." "We'll make it," Hartwell said automatically, though even he wasn't sure. The fighters wheeled away, regrouping for another pass. The radio crackled. A voice, faint, distant. "Hartwell, this is Hayes, 305th. We're behind you, same altitude." Relief hit like oxygen. Another YB-40 had fallen behind two gunships instead of 1. 32 guns between them. Hayes dropped altitude to join formation, his bomber sliding into place off Hartwell's left wing. "Let's stick together," he said over the channel. "Might scare them off." "They're not easily scared," Hartwell replied. The 2 heavy fortresses lumbered on side by side, the ocean still far away. The Luftwaffe circled wider now, patient hunters measuring their prey. Every minute felt like an hour, every second a gamble with fate. As the coast came into view, gray and distant under the sinking sun, Morrison called out fuel remaining. 72 minutes, no more. The engines coughed, heat shimmering from the cowlings. "We're not out of France yet," Delaney reminded them quietly, as if the sky itself could hear. Then, at 4:52 p.m., 2 Messerschmitt 109s appeared at 6 o'clock high, diving fast. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Raymond Cack, a ski shooting champion from Cleveland before the war, opened fire. His tracers crossed the sky like burning threads, but the fighters kept coming. Cannon shells slammed into the fuselage, tearing holes through the tail. One detonated 2 feet behind Cack, blowing splinters of aluminum past his face. Hartwell felt the controls go heavy. Elevator trim jammed, hydraulics gone. The plane groaned like a dying animal, but somehow it held together. The fighters wheeled away, regrouping for another pass. The radio crackled, a voice, faint, distant. "Hartwell, this is Hayes, 305th. We're behind you, same altitude." Relief hit like oxygen. Another YB-40 had fallen behind two gunships instead of 1. 32 guns between them. Hayes dropped altitude to join formation, his bomber sliding into place off Hartwell's left wing. "Let's stick together," he said over the channel. "Might scare them off." "They're not easily scared," Hartwell replied. The two heavy fortresses lumbered on side by side, the ocean still far away. The Luftwaffe circled wider now, patient hunters measuring their prey. Every minute felt like an hour, every second a gamble with fate. As the coast came into view, gray and distant under the sinking sun, Morrison called out fuel remaining. 72 minutes, no more. The engines coughed, heat shimmering from the cowlings. "We're not out of France yet," Delaney reminded them quietly, as if the sky itself could hear. Then, at 4:52 p.m., two Messerschmitt 109s appeared at 6 o'clock high, diving fast. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Raymond Cack, a ski shooting champion from Cleveland before the war, opened fire. His tracers crossed the sky like burning threads, but the fighters kept coming. Cannon shells slammed into the fuselage, tearing holes through the tail. One detonated 2 feet behind Cack, blowing splinters of aluminum past his face. Hartwell felt the controls go heavy. Elevator trim jammed, hydraulics gone. The plane groaned like a dying animal, but somehow it held together. The fighters wheeled away, regrouping for another pass. The radio crackled. A voice. Faint. Distant. "Hartwell. This is Hayes. 305th. We're behind you."
Same altitude. Relief. The horizon burnt gold as the sun sank into the Atlantic haze, and two lonely bombers dragged themselves toward it. Hedgehog and Hayes's YB-40 flew side by side, heavy and wounded, their wings shuddering from the strain. The air inside the cabins was thick with cordite, oil, and the cold stench of fear. Below them, France stretched endlessly, a patchwork of dark forests, rivers glinting like knives, and enemy territory from edge to edge. Hartwell glanced to his left and saw Hayes through the cockpit glass, raising a gloved hand in salute. They were both crippled, both low on fuel, both too slow to keep up with the world racing ahead of them. The radio crackled between bursts of static. "You holding together, James?" Hayes asked, voice thin from distance. "Barely," Hartwell replied. "Three's running hot, hydraulics shot, trim jammed." "Same here. Number two's oil pressure dropping fast." The silence that followed said everything. Neither aircraft would survive another fight. They were too slow to flee, too heavy to hide. All they could do was keep flying west, 1 mile at a time, hoping the sea would arrive before the Luftwaffe did. At 5:07 p.m., they crossed the coastline, the gray water of the channel stretching out beneath them. 53 miles of open sea now stood between them and England. 53 miles of exposed airspace where nothing could save them if fighters returned. Morrison checked the fuel gauges. 90 minutes on paper, he said quietly, but that's fantasy. We've got an hour, maybe less. Hartwell adjusted the throttles with frozen fingers, the control yoke stiff as concrete. The engines groaned but held. The airspeed wavered at 142 miles per hour. Every vibration, every flicker of the needles on the dashboard felt personal now, as though the machine itself were clinging to life by sheer will. They had made it this far, but survival was a question of minutes. Then, as if summoned by the thought, Delaney shouted from the waist, "Bandits, 6 o'clock high!" Two tiny dots against the sun, growing larger with terrifying speed. Messerschmitt 109s. The Germans had followed them out to sea. The tail gunner, Koch, swung his turret around, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. "Range 800, closing fast," he called. The fighters dove steeply, sunlight glinting off their canopies, cannon flashes blooming like sparks. Shells ripped through the air. One tore across the tailplane, another exploded near the right stabilizer, jolting the entire aircraft. The fuselage groaned, the world shaking violently. "We've lost pressure again," Morrison yelled. "Number three's overheating." "Hold it together," Hartwell barked. The YB-40's guns thundered in reply, every barrel spitting fire. The ball turrets spun beneath them. Waist gunners raked the sky, tracers crossing in brilliant arcs. The lead Messerschmitt twisted hard to avoid the streams of lead, banking away in a streak of smoke. His wingman pressed closer, firing another burst that shattered a window near the radio compartment. Fragments tore into the bulkhead, slicing Delaney's sleeve. "He's hit!" someone screamed, but Delaney waved it off, blood already freezing against his arm. "Just a scratch! Keep firing!" Koch tracked the second fighter as it pulled up to climb again, his sights glowing red in the dusk. He squeezed the triggers. The guns roared. The German fighter shuddered, a puff of flame blossoming from its wing root. It broke right, rolled, and plunged toward the sea. The crew erupted in cheers that died almost immediately. The remaining Messerschmitt had vanished into the clouds. "He's still up there," Morrison said. "He's waiting." Hartwell tightened his grip on the yoke. Let him wait. They flew on in tense silence, engines droning like distant thunder. Then, out of nowhere, new voices crackled through the radio, American accents. "This is Red Leader, 56 Fighter Group. We've got eyes on you, stragglers. Hang on, boys." Out of the northeast, 4 P-47 Thunderbolts descended, sunlight flashing on their wings. The most beautiful sight Hartwell had ever seen. The Messerschmitt broke cover and fled east, disappearing into the haze before the Thunderbolts even reached firing range. The escort fighters didn't chase, they simply slid into formation alongside the limping bombers, waggling their wings in salute. Home was only 29 miles away. Morrison looked at the fuel gauge again. 37 minutes left at this power setting. Barely enough. Below, the channel shimmered like liquid steel. For the first time in hours, Hartwell allowed himself to breathe. "We'll make it," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Hayes' voice crackled over the radio, weaker now. "Number 2's gone. She seized up. We're losing altitude." Hartwell watched as Hayes' bomber dip lower, one propeller frozen solid, smoke trailing from the nacelle. "Divert to Manston," he called. "You can't reach Alconbury." "Copy that," Hayes replied, his tone steady, almost peaceful. "See you on the ground." The two planes began to drift apart, one limping north, one holding course west. When the English coastline finally appeared through the haze, it didn't look like salvation, just a gray smudge of land rising from the sea. Hartwell guided Hedgehog toward it, the controls shaking violently. "Gear down. Manual crank." Morrison climbed to the side panel and began turning the wheel by hand, muscle by muscle. The right landing gear locked with 15 seconds to spare before touchdown. At 6:18 p.m., Hedgehog hit the runway at Alconbury, the tires screaming against the tarmac. The engine sputtered and died. Silence filled the cockpit. Outside, ground crews ran toward them through the fading light. Hartwell sat there for a long moment, hands trembling, then finally exhaled. They had made it, but just barely. The flying destroyer proved one thing beyond all doubt. It could kill anything in the sky, but it could not outrun its own flaws. The gunship built to protect others nearly died protecting itself.
The engines ticked softly as they cooled, metal expanding and contracting under the weight of silence. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving RAF Alconbury washed in the dull orange light of dusk. The ground crew surrounded Hedgehog, counting bullet holes, tracing fingers along the jagged wounds that marked her fuselage. 16 punctures in the skin, one severed hydraulic line, a jammed trim tab, a cracked stabilizer. She was alive, but barely. Captain James Hartwell climbed down from the cockpit, his flight suit soaked in sweat, his hands shaking from the strain of holding the yoke against a frozen elevator for almost 2 hours. He walked toward Colonel William Reed, who was waiting near the hardstand with a clipboard in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Reed's face was unreadable. "Well, Captain?" he asked. Hartwell looked back at his aircraft, the plane that had saved their lives and almost killed them in the same breath. He took a long moment before answering. "It can't keep up." 3 words, quiet but final. The colonel nodded slowly, exhaling smoke through his nose. Around them, the maintenance crews worked without pause, patching holes, draining fuel, cataloging damage. The flying destroyer had gone to war and come home crippled. Yet the Army Air Forces weren't ready to let go of the dream. Reed ordered 7 more missions. Maybe, he reasoned, the first one was an anomaly. Maybe new tactics, new formations could make the concept work. Hartwell didn't argue. Orders were orders. But deep down, he knew the problem wasn't tactics, it was physics. The YB-40 was born from desperation, not design. It was a fortress weighed down by its own promise. The second mission came on June 15th, target Le Mans. 4 YB-40s launched alongside their bomber groups, sunlight flashing off their turrets as they climbed into formation. By the time they reached the French coast, all 4 were lagging behind. None made it home with their assigned groups. They arrived hours later, exhausted and alone. 10 days later, on June 22nd, 11 YB-40s flew to attack the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant at Huls. Flak and fighters tore into the formation. 1 YB-40 went down in flames. The rest straggled home in scattered pairs. Each mission ended the same way: heavy, slow, isolated. The YB-40s were supposed to protect the weak, but they had become the weak ones. Back at Alconbury, the engineers tore into the problem. At Abbott's Ripton Depot, mechanics stripped panels, weighed ammunition, adjusted turret placements. They moved ammo boxes forward to correct the center of gravity, modified the feed chutes for the waste guns, experimented with lighter armor around crew stations. Nothing worked. The truth was simple and cruel. A standard B-17F took off at around 65,000 pounds, dropped its bombs, and came home at 48. The YB-40 started at 68,000 and ended the mission at 64. It could not shed its weight. It carried 11,000 rounds of ammunition even when none were fired. It was a fortress that couldn't fly like one. On July 28th, 6 YB-40s went back to Saint-Nazaire, the same place where it had all begun. They claimed 1 confirmed kill, a Focke-Wulf that dove too close to their wall of fire. Every aircraft returned riddled with holes. Every aircraft had fallen behind. One crew reported being alone over France for 43 minutes before reaching the Channel. 43 minutes of waiting for death that never came. The statistics told a story better than any report. 48 sorties flown, 5 confirmed German fighters destroyed, 2 probable, 1 YB-40 lost. Every single one had fallen behind its formation after the bomb drop. The average separation was 7 miles. The average time alone, 38 minutes. In the offices of 8th Bomber Command, intelligence officers compiled the data and sent it up the chain. The Luftwaffe had already adapted. German pilots quickly recognized the YB-40s in combat: extra turret on the fuselage, no bomb bay doors, distinctive silhouette. They knew the heavy bombers were slower, knew exactly where they would fall in the formation. The hunters no longer avoided the flying destroyers. They targeted them first. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's fighter chief, reviewed the captured intelligence and dismissed the entire project with one brutal comment: "They're good targets. They die slow." By July, morale among the YB-40 crews was slipping. Hartwell flew 2 more missions, both uneventful, both ending the same way, with hours of solitude over enemy lines and the engines screaming for mercy. In one debrief, his waist gunner described the experience like this: "It's like trying to outrun a wolf on a broken leg. You keep firing, but you know how it ends." Even so, the crews kept flying. They were soldiers, not dreamers. The final missions of July brought the inevitable conclusion. On the 29th, 2 YB-40s flew their last combat run over Kiel. Both fell behind. Both were intercepted. Both required P-47 escorts to limp home. By August, the order came down from General Karl Spaatz himself. The program was finished. The dream of the flying destroyer was over. The remaining 12 aircraft were stripped, de-armed, and prepared for shipment back to the United States. The concept that had begun with so much promise had died after just 3 months. The YB-40 had been meant to save the bomber crews of Europe. Instead, it had nearly gotten its own crews killed. Yet hidden inside that failure was something extraordinary, an innovation that would soon reshape the war and save thousands of lives.
By early August 1943, the experiment was over, and the YB-40s were ghosts drifting across the airfields of England. Hulking silhouettes parked on the edge of runways, engines silent, gun barrels still blackened from their final fights. For weeks, mechanics walked around them with clipboards, measuring the angles of the chin turrets, weighing ammunition belts, noting the performance data that had cost lives to obtain. The flying destroyer had not saved the bomber stream,
but it had revealed truths no engineer could ignore. The idea of turning a bomber into a gunship had failed, but in its failure lay the blueprint for the future of air war. When the test results reached Wright Field in Ohio, the Army Air Force's engineering staff didn't laugh or curse. They studied. The twin-gun chin turret, the single most important innovation of the YB-40, had proven so effective against head-on attacks that it was immediately selected for installation on the next generation of Flying Fortress. That model, the B-17G, would become the definitive version of the aircraft, the one that could finally defend itself from every angle. The lessons of Bastogne had come from courage. The lessons of the YB-40 came from pain. Hartwell didn't stay in England long after the program ended. He was reassigned to the States as an instructor, teaching new pilots how to handle the temperamental engines of the Flying Fortress. But even on quiet nights at the training base in Utah, he could still hear the hum of the YB-40's 4 Cyclone engines, still feel the weight of that impossible machine straining against the sky. He used to tell his students, "Airplanes are like men. They're not built to carry everything at once. You pile on too much armor, too much cope, and sooner or later, they stop climbing." The Army officially retired the YB-40 fleet in September 1943. Most were stripped for parts, a few were turned into training aircraft, flying without turrets or guns. But one remained whole: Hedgehog, the battered survivor that had limped home from Saint-Nazaire and Le Mans. She was stored in a hangar at Alconbury for months, her nose art fading under the damp English air. Then, quietly, she was scrapped. The war had no room for relics that didn't fit the story of victory. Yet the irony was unmistakable. The YB-40 had failed as a weapon, but it had succeeded as a teacher. The modifications that doomed it, extra armor, heavy turrets, extended ammunition feeds, had revealed precisely where the limits of the B-17 lay. It showed the engineers how to balance firepower with range, protection with speed, and it proved something even more valuable, that no aircraft, no matter how well armed, could fight the war alone. Across the Channel, the air war raged on. The 8th Air Force continued its daylight raids, bleeding men and machines over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen. Each mission carried the same risk the YB-40 had tried to erase: long-range exposure without escort. But in the laboratories and planning rooms of England, American engineers were already building the real solution: a new kind of fighter with the speed to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Its name was the P-51 Mustang. It would arrive too late for the YB-40, but not too late for the thousands of crews who followed. Historians would later argue that the YB-40 was a bridge design, a necessary failure that led to success. Without its chin turret, the B-17G might have fallen to pieces under frontal attack. Without its weight problems, engineers might never have realized the true need for lightweight escort fighters. The flying destroyer had been born in panic, lived in chaos, and died in obscurity. But its ghost haunted every bomber that came after. Hartwell, for his part, never called it a failure. In one letter to his wife, written in December 1943, he said, "It didn't save us, but it taught us how to survive." As the war turned in 1944, waves of silver Mustangs filled the skies over Europe. Their long-range tanks gleaming in the sunlight, they escorted the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, fought the Luftwaffe head-on, and won. When those P-51s returned home, they often passed over airfields littered with rusting YB-40 carcasses, the forgotten ancestors of their triumph. In that irony lay a quiet truth: sometimes the path to victory begins with something that cannot win. The legacy of the flying destroyer was not written in medals or monuments, but in the design blueprints that shaped the machines that followed. Every gunner who survived a head-on attack in a B-17G owed his life to the men who had flown the YB-40 first. Every pilot who watched a P-51 appear out of nowhere to drive off a measurement owed a debt to the failure that proved bombers could not save themselves. As for Hartwell, he lived long enough to see his students fly over Berlin, to see the war end, and to read the headlines that declared the unbreakable air armada of the United States had finally conquered the skies. He never spoke much about his own missions. When asked about the YB-40 years later, he smiled and said only this: "It flew like a brick, but it taught us how to build wings." By the winter of 1943, the lesson of the YB-40 had already seeped into every hangar and design office from Seattle to Suffolk. The air war over Europe had turned into an arms race, measured not just in firepower, but in imagination. Boeing's engineers, armed with combat data from Hartwell's missions and dozens of others, began reshaping the B-17 itself. The first prototype of the new B-17G rolled out of the factory in late July, a machine that looked familiar but carried the ghost of the flying destroyer in every rivet. The chin turret that once made the YB-40 a lumbering anomaly was now standard issue. It was lighter, smoother, and integrated perfectly into the airframe. The gunner could finally defend against the deadly head-on attacks that had haunted bomber crews since the first raids on Bremen. Each new fortress carried 13 50-caliber guns, a configuration balanced for both weight and protection. The armor plating was redistributed, the ammunition load reduced, and the engines tuned to carry it all without complaint. The B-17G could fly higher, faster, and longer than the YB-40 ever dreamed. But evolution came at a cost. For every improvement, there had been a pilot like Hartwell to find the limit, a crew like his to pay the price in shattered wings and burned hands. Across England, airfields were filling with the next generation of aircraft, sleek, silver giants gleaming in the frost. Men who had once laughed at the clumsy gunship now stood in awe of the B-17G's precision. When the first squadrons took them into combat in September 1943, the change was immediate. Luftwaffe fighters who had grown used to attacking from the front suddenly found their prey biting back. Reports from bomber formations described German fighters breaking off attacks after taking devastating fire from the new turrets. "It was like flying with a shield in front of us," one tailgunner wrote in his log. Still, even the upgraded fortresses couldn't win alone. The raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg in October proved that. Hundreds of bombers launched without fighter escort, and 60 were lost in a single day. The message was unmistakable. Better guns weren't enough. The sky needed guardians that could fight and chase and still bring the bombers home. That guardian was already waiting on the tarmac at Debden, the P-51 Mustang, its Merlin engine purring with quiet confidence. When the first Mustangs crossed the Rhine in early 1944, the balance of power in the air shifted for good. Hartwell, now an instructor in Utah, followed the war through radio bulletins and letters from old crewmen. Each time a student returned from Europe, he'd ask the same question: "How's she flying?" The answers made him smile. "Better, sir. Faster. The new chin turrets work like a dream." Sometimes they'd add, "We've got Mustangs now. They go all the way." Hartwell would nod, proud but wistful. He'd tell them, "Remember what it cost to make her that way." They never really understood what he meant until they saw a crippled fortress limp home on 3 engines. In the spring of 1944, the new fortresses became the backbone of the 8th Air Force. They thundered across Europe in tight formations of silver, thousands strong, bombing rail yards, factories, and oil depots that kept Hitler's armies alive. Behind them, the long-range Mustangs carved through the sky, chasing down the Luftwaffe wherever it hid. Together, they turned daylight bombing from suicide to strategy. The men who flew them didn't know they were living inside the legacy of a failure. They only knew they were winning. At Boeing's Seattle plant, engineers kept a single YB-40 tail section in a corner of the assembly line. Scorched and twisted, but never discarded. It was a reminder of what had come before. A silent teacher standing guard over the birth of the new fortresses. One engineer carved a small plaque and bolted it to the wreckage. It read, "It couldn't keep up, but it showed us how." Those who worked the night shift would touch it for luck before going back to their tools. Back in England, the first B-17Gs to return from deep inside Germany carried a different energy. Crews stepped off grinning, jackets stained with sweat, hands trembling, not from fear, but from adrenaline. For the first time, they had fought and returned with minimal loss. The newspapers called it the turning of the tide. What they didn't mention was that buried inside every one of those planes was a piece of the YB-40's spirit. A machine that had failed in its mission, but succeeded in giving its successors the chance to live. Hartwell wrote in his journal that winter, "We built a ship too heavy for its own wings, and from its wreck, we learned to fly farther than we ever thought possible." He didn't see it as redemption. He saw it as evolution, the necessary pain before progress. Every bolt, every turret, every scar on his hands had been part of something larger than himself. By the time D-Day came, the skies over Normandy belonged to the Allies. Waves of fortresses and liberators blanketed the beaches, their bombs falling in perfect symmetry. P-51s darted between them like hawks, cutting down anything with a black cross. From his stateside classroom, Hartwell listened to the radio broadcasts of the invasion. When he heard the name Bastogne again months later, it was no longer a lonely town in Belgium, but a symbol of endurance, proof that when air and ground worked together, nothing could stop them. The flying fortress had finally become what its name promised, and it owed that transformation to the ugly, lumbering experiment that had dared to fail first.
By the time 1944 turned to 1945, the air war over Europe had become a storm of fire and steel. But within that chaos, there was an eerie sense of rhythm. Bombers no longer flew in small, desperate groups. They filled the sky in endless waves, silver phantoms gliding through the cold morning light. The roar of engines was constant, the drone of 4,000 propellers merging into a single, unbroken hum that could be heard for miles. To the civilians below, it was the sound of inevitability. To men like Hartwell, listening from across an ocean, it was the sound of ghosts, echoes of machines that had come before. Every time a formation of B-17Gs passed overhead, he could hear the YB-40 in their bones, the whisper of the gunship that couldn't keep up but refused to be forgotten. In Europe, that legacy was everywhere. On the frozen airfields of East Anglia, young pilots strapped into gleaming fortresses that looked flawless on the surface, never realizing the lineage that ran through their rivets. They joked about the chin turrets, called them shark jaws, without knowing that those jaws had once been the salvation of a dying crew over France. Each gun position, each curve of aluminum, carried within it the DNA of a machine that had burned out too early, a test bed that gave its life so that others could fly longer, faster, stronger. Over Germany, the fortresses roamed with a new kind of confidence. They were no longer prey. When the Luftwaffe came, the sky erupted with tracer fire, crisscrossing like glowing threads against the pale blue dome. German pilots, who had once stalked bombers with ease, now faced a wall of lead that seemed to come from every direction. The chin turrets, once mocked as unnecessary, now shredded entire squadrons of attacking fighters before they could fire a single shot. "They hit us from the front," one German ace recalled bitterly, "and it was suicide." The B-17G had turned the hunter into the hunted. In January 1945, a group of new airmen arrived at Outgunned, the same base where Hedgehog had taken off nearly 2 years earlier. The old hangar still bore the scars of flak fragments and engine fires. Tucked in a corner behind stacks of spare propellers sat the skeletal frame of a YB-40 tail section, half covered by a tarp. Most didn't even notice it. But one mechanic, Sergeant Joe Rains, uncovered it out of curiosity. Faded letters, still visible under the grime, spelled Hedgehog. He ran his hand over the bullet holes and smiled quietly. Later that week, he carved a small piece of its aluminum skin and riveted it inside the fuselage of a new B-17G named Silverbell. "For luck," he said. That fragment of metal would cross the Rhine 2 months later and return home safely. In that small, silent act, the YB-40 flew again. While the war thundered on in Europe, Hartwell's classroom in Utah grew emptier. His students were shipping out faster than he could train them. Some wrote back with letters that smelled of oil and smoke, describing the things he already knew: the tremble of the controls in thin air, the smell of burnt powder, the way the engines sounded when they were about to give up. They thanked him for his lessons, for teaching them how to trust the machine but never worship it.
He kept those letters in a wooden box by his bed, next to the flight log from Hedgehog. In its pages were notations written in pencil, each one a memory frozen in time. Engine number 3, overheating. Hydraulics, shot. Enemy fighters, too close to count. He never erased them. They were reminders of what the sky demanded and what it gave back. When the news of victory in Europe came in May 1945, Hartwell stood outside his hangar and listened to the distant rumble of aircraft passing overhead. The war was ending, but the sound was the same, endless, powerful, alive. Somewhere above him, fortresses were heading home, the last of them flying east toward the Atlantic. He closed his eyes and imagined them as a single, endless chain, stretching from the factories of Seattle to the ruins of Berlin, each one carrying the spirit of the men who had flown before. Somewhere among them, invisible but ever present, was Hedgehog, the flying destroyer that had started it all. In the years that followed, the world moved on. The bombers that once ruled the skies were scrapped, their metal melted down to build new machines for new wars. The YB-40 became a footnote in aviation history, a curious experiment mentioned in passing by scholars and collectors. But for those who had flown her, she was more than a prototype. She was a teacher carved from aluminum and courage. Every time a pilot survives an attack, Hartwell once said, some part of that victory belongs to the machines that didn't. By the 1950s, airshows filled American skies with jets, sleek and futuristic, screaming faster than sound. Few spectators knew that the roots of those miracles lay in the piston engines and crude turrets of an earlier age. When a silver B-17G occasionally appeared at those shows, trailing white smoke in salute, the crowd saw nostalgia. Hartwell saw history. He saw every rivet that had been tested by fire, every mistake that had been paid for in blood. He saw the YB-40 again, lumbering through flak, the engines groaning, the guns glowing red-hot, and the will to survive burning brighter than any engine could. That was the echo in the sky, the sound of lessons that refused to die, of courage that had no expiration date. It wasn't just a hum of propellers or a crack of machine guns. It was the voice of all those who dared to fly something imperfect so that perfection could one day exist. And though time buried the name YB-40 beneath the legends that came after, its spirit never left the clouds. It lingered in every flight, in every aircraft that carried its descendants through the heavens, whispering the same truth McAuliffe had learned on the ground and Hartwell had learned in the air. That even failure, if it flies far enough, becomes history.
When the war ended, the great silver fleets of bombers that had once darkened the skies began to vanish. Runways across England, France, and Italy filled with rows of silent aircraft, their engines cold, their wings sagging under the weight of peace. The B-17s that had once carried the fate of nations now waited for the torch and the scrap dealer. Thousands were melted down, turned into the bones of a new world, cars, bridges, skyscrapers. Yet somewhere among the endless wreckage of steel and aluminum, the ghost of the YB-40 still lingered. It was there in every gun turret salvaged for study, in every engineer's blueprint drawn with quiet reverence for what had come before. The flying destroyer was gone, but its fingerprints remained everywhere. In the post-war years, when aviation leapt forward with jet engines and swept wings, a few old pilots still spoke of the machine that had taught them humility. They remembered its growl, its weight, the way it had shuddered against gravity and defied reason. To them, the YB-40 was not a failure. It was the sound of courage disguised as metal. James Hartwell lived to see the dawn of the jet age. He watched television footage of sleek F-86 Sabres carving contrails over Korea, their pilots calm and confident, their cockpits filled with dials he could hardly recognize. Once, while visiting an air museum in 1957, he stopped in front of a restored B-17G. Its polished aluminum gleamed under the spotlights, its chin turret spotless and proud. A small plaque on the floor read, "This aircraft represents the final form of the Flying Fortress, first flown in 1943. The chin turret design was pioneered on the experimental YB-40 gunship. Hartwell stood there for a long time, staring at those words, his reflection warped in the metal. Visitors passed by without noticing the quiet old man tracing his fingers along the rivets. He smiled faintly, whispering, "We did all right, old girl." The YB-40 story never made the front pages, but within the archives of the U.S. Air Force, its name lived on. In training manuals, the lessons learned from its weight distribution and power limitations became the foundation of future aircraft design. When Boeing engineers began sketching the B-29 Superfortress, they carried the ghosts of the YB-40 in their notes. Lighter frames, centralized fire control, efficiency over brute force. Decades later, when jet bombers like the B-52 roared into service, the same philosophy still echoed: speed, range, precision, and balance. The dream that the YB-40 had failed to achieve by muscle alone had finally been realized through evolution. Even in culture, its spirit found strange ways to survive. Hollywood's war films of the 1950s and 60s often portrayed brave crews in flying fortresses holding the line against overwhelming odds. They never mentioned the YB-40 by name, but its silhouette lived in every cinematic frame of defiance. The glint of sunlight on turret glass, the trembling hands of gunners firing into endless skies. The myth of the invincible bomber had roots not in success, but in failure, born from the stubbornness of men who refused to surrender to physics or fear. Hartwell retired quietly in the late 1960s, his medals tucked away, his flight log yellowed with age. He spent his final years near Puget Sound, where he could hear aircraft overhead every afternoon. When the last operational B-17 flew past during a commemorative air show in 1972, he stood outside on his porch, looking up as the 4 engines droned across the clouds. For a moment, the sound carried him back to the freezing skies over France, the smell of oil and gunpowder, the ache in his hands as he held the yoke of hedgehog against the wind. He could still feel the vibration of the guns, the roar of the cyclones, and the weight of responsibility pressing against his chest. And though no one else could hear it, beneath that deep rolling thunder, there was another sound, fainter, older, but unmistakable. The echo of a machine that had once dared to do the impossible. In his final letter to a friend, Hartwell wrote, "Every failure that flies is one step closer to something that will never fall. The YB-40 carried us further than we could see. It didn't keep up, but it never gave up, and that's the part worth remembering." Years later, a group of aviation historians uncovered the surviving blueprints and mission reports of the YB-40. They restored one turret and displayed it in the small museum in Dayton, Ohio. On the plaque beneath it were engraved words chosen from Hartwell's letter. It didn't keep up, but it never gave up. Visitors who passed by often paused to read the inscription, then looked up at the massive metal guns gleaming under the light, realizing that they were not just looking at a relic of war, but at a symbol of human persistence. And so, the YB-40's legacy lived on, not as the aircraft that won battles, but as the one that taught others how to survive them. Its failures became lessons, its scars became blueprints, and its spirit became the invisible foundation upon which modern aviation was built. In every contrail that cuts across a clear sky, in every aircraft that dares to go higher, faster, farther, there is a whisper from 1943. A whisper of engines groaning under weight, of men refusing to surrender, of courage forged in steel and sky. The flying destroyer never reached its destination, but it carried the world a little closer to its own.